This works, yeah.
This is what I should do.
Huh?
Should I use this one?
Yes.
So we had enough spaces so far. There were two left. There were 2 spaces left.
Okay.
And plus a handicap.
Yeah.
And the people from other places are parking here for their businesses.
Yeah, they do
And
on
they said they
Saturday.
paid.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Maybe at the end, Cliff, you should just maybe at the end. If you do Q&A, that's fine. But if you feel like we have a microphone while we can take it around if you have a little question. But maybe you should just ask how many people plan to come back
Okay.
at 2 o'clock tomorrow.
All right. All right.
If they'll just do it today or whatever. Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Well, thank you for all coming. I'm Sally Owen, and for the last 24 years, I have been offering monthly nature or historic tours in Quincy. Generally, they're walks around, and this is the first one where we are having a lot inside. And so we're really grateful to the Reverend Clifford Brown and his parishioners for offering to do this. I'm also very grateful to Marcus Johnson, a professional musician who has agreed to lead the music. You can try singing today. So I sent out to everyone on the email list that when I send out the notice of the April tour, which is going to be celebrating Earth Day and Signs of Spring, I'm going to attach a lot of material for you to explore further the topics here. I will also have information about, is this being taped?
Yes,
okay. It's going to be taped.
It's already live streamed.
And so you're going to be able to watch it on YouTube, and there's going to be tons of information. So if you're not on the email list for getting the notices monthly from the Park Department, and you want to get this information, you should sign up for it. And when you registered, it tells you how to do that. So I think that's all I need to say. I also want to thank Maura O'Gara, who's been helping me with these tours. And again, thanks to all of the people at the Christ Church and Marcus Johnson for offering their services today.
So just a little technical things. The exits are in the back and on the side. The restrooms are located, for those of you who have difficulty perhaps with stairs, there's a fully bathroom up here on this floor, and then there are bathrooms on the lower level as well. And our parishioners will be happy to guide you if you need assistance. For those of you who are overly cautious, as I am sometimes, we are ventilating. We always ventilate the main church, so there are windows open here and here to let some air into the building, and the heat is on as well. So I hope you enjoy this space. And it is a joy to welcome you all here to this sacred space. As you will find out, Christ Church has been here since, in one form or another, since 1689. We are, as you will hear in a moment, we are the second oldest church in Quincy after United First Parish. And so even though this isn't the building that Louise Catherine Adams would have worshipped in, we're going to start off by hearing the wonderful voice of Marcus singing selections from the hymn that she wrote for the dedication of the first wooden building that was built here in 1832. She was a lifetime parishioner here. Just as an aside, she wasn't fond of living in Quincy, from my understanding, and she spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and actually, when she died, she was buried from St. John's Episcopal Church down there. Her body rested in a temporary vault down there for, I think, over a year. When she was brought back up here to be buried in the First Parish Church, the rector of Christ Church officiated at the burial service for her. So she was a Church of England member all of her life, and later on, as Church of England became Episcopalian, she was an Episcopalian. So I'm going to turn it over to Marcus and let him, I don't know whether you want to introduce the song, but I don't know the tune or anything else. It's not familiar to me, so I'll let you give a little blurb. you, Marcus, and I'm sure many of you might have heard him, and he gave concerts at the Quincy Public Library, at Faith Lutheran, and he's a well-known pianist and singer and organist, and so I thank you again, Marcus. So again, I would just like to welcome everyone here this morning on a rainy morning. Who would have thought in March that we would be having this weather, but there you go, it is what it is. I'd also like to just recognize that there are a number of people who have at some point either come through this building for a church fair or a wedding or a funeral, as well as our sister church, St. Chrysostom's down in Wollaston. And Faith Lutheran up on the hill, which Marcus's grandmother is here, and she's a pillar of that congregation as well. So I'm going to start off with a quote. "It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." And that's Winston Churchill's famous description of Russia in 1939 when asked about the nation's intentions and interests. And I think that's applicable to what I'm about to offer to you, because recovering reliable historical information about the early history of this parish is a riddle. And historic facts remain a mystery of its association with those parishioners who are part of the trade of enslaved African people and the commodities produced by enslaved African people, and also along with the indentured workers of Germantown. And then this being Quincy, we always talk about the Quincy, the Adams family, and this parish also had a relationship with the Adams family, particularly through, as we just heard Marcus sing, Louise Catherine Johnson Adams. And then I also want to say up front that I'm speaking, we all speak from certain biases. Well, I'm speaking, my bias is that I'm a Christian that leans toward the liberal end of faith. I'm a white man at the age of 68 who grew up in Cambridge at a time when it was filled with changing lifestyles and human rights, equality, and war and peace in the United States. And so I was taught at a very young age to question, not to take things as written, but to question and to discover on my own what I believe. And I also say that as well when it comes to religion. And I'm also the current pastor of this historic parish, and so I am somewhat biased in how I present its founding. And then also, as I go on, I'm not going to try to distinguish between the northern precinct of Braintree, which was the name of this area until 1792, when the area was split off from Braintree and became Quincy. I'm going to mostly use the name Quincy, even though at that time it probably wasn't called that. So I'm going to also give a very brief presentation of what was going on at that particular time. And many of you probably know this from our history classes. And if it was like me, you probably only heard the side of the winners of the founders of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And Massachusetts Bay Colony was initially under the governorship of John Winthrop. And John Winthrop was a very controversial man who later on history would say he was an autocrat, and he was a manipulator, and he used very aggressive tactics to subdue any emerging faiths and traditions beyond those of Puritanism. And we know that those who were banished included Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson and Thomas Hooker. We know that the Quakers who were trying to make a home here were persecuted and jailed, and Mary Dyer was executed. And so all of that plays into the time period of the founding of Christ Church. And all those belonging to the Church of England at that time, they actually weren't allowed to worship together. They were banned. As was anyone else. The Church of England people, they were tolerated because of their association with the crown in England. And also we may remember, because I don't remember it in my history teaching, but Winthrop was first to formally sanction human bondage in the American colonies. I had no idea he was the first one. And he was the primary instigator of the establishment of an act called the Body of Liberties Law. It was enacted in 1641, and it remained in place until 1783. And that was the first act in the colonies of the United States to allow people to enslave other people. And John Winthrop described the burgeoning trade relationship between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the West Indies, meaning the slave trade. He declared it as an act of God. And as a full-fledged Puritan, Winthrop was convinced that God had elected him to salvation or sainthood. And he truly desired to be free from the English monarchy, as well as from the Church of England with its bishops. He was one of the biggest forces of trying to keep a bishop coming over and settling in the colonies of the United States. He and several others, Increase Mather and other Puritans, fought. That was their main concern, which to us seems kind of trivial, but to them that was a huge concern, is to keep anything that had to do with a bishop out of the colonies, because they were fearful of their ability to sway people and to take control. And the other thing is that each Puritan church was inextricably twined with the local government. So before you were called to town, you had to have a parish church. And in that church, absolutely everyone was required to attend the services on Sunday, weekday services, and any other special occasions. And they were also required, despite your faith or no faith at all, they were required to pay a local tax to support the minister of that church. And that town owned the meeting house where it was built. And not only was it held for Sunday services, political meetings and votings and everything else were taken there. And at the same time, just as they did in England, the Reverend John Hancock, the minister of the First Parish Church, wrote in his diary, "Just as the law was in England for the Church of England to do this, the same requirement took place in colonial Massachusetts Bay. All births, baptisms, weddings, and deaths had to be recorded in the register of the Congregational Church. Town and church were the same. There was no distinguishing between the two of them. And so the very early records of Quincy are recorded in what is now the First Parish Church in Quincy Center, but the earliest records of baptisms, weddings, funerals, everything else were recorded, regardless of your faith tradition, were recorded in that church. And so finally in 1639, this area of what was called Braintree was separated. And the official parish church of Quincy was set apart in 1639 as an independent Puritan congregational meeting house. And so that's kind of the background where our parish was in when those who were following the Church of England worship style, they were few in number, but they were here living in Quincy. And they continued to hold on to their Church of England faith tradition. And so what they would do is they would very quietly worship as the Church of England, meaning using a prayer book, a Book of Common Prayer, at least since 1689 in a private homes. And primarily the home of Ensign William Vesey and his wife Mary Saunders was where they met. And they continued to persevere. They faced great religious discrimination, and they also faced a potential fine for worshiping in a private home, because that was against the Puritan rules, to worship in a private space. And they also were required to pay the congregational church tax to support the minister. And what that meant, in another way, was that they didn't have the money. If they had somebody come over from England, they didn't have the money to support him as a minister. And the Church of England was aware of all of the difficulties that its congregation in the colonies were facing. And so in 1702, the Church of England established the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And this society was formed primarily to work in the colonies of Great Britain, including here in Massachusetts. And what they were able to do was they were able to provide clergy to come from England and be missioners to those who upheld the Church of England faith in the colonies of Massachusetts and beyond. They weren't welcomed in Massachusetts. They weren't welcomed in Braintree. The Society of the Propagation of the Gospel sent 2 clergy people over to kind of help shepherd the fledgling Christ Church. The first one left, and he didn't have a very good reputation. In fact, after he left, people questioned whether he was actually a legitimate clergy person from the Church of England because he was so bad. The second one came, and he was met with such hostility and name-calling when he arrived that he packed up his belongings and headed off to Newbury, because a church was established in Newbury in the colonies, and the people there were a little bit more tolerant of having a Church of England established, and so he went and became the minister up at the church in Newbury. And the other thing that wasn't allowed by the Puritan Congregational Church here in Quincy was that we were not allowed to own absolutely any land whatsoever as a Church of England. There was you just couldn't have it happen. They wanted to keep the Church of England out so bad that they made a law saying you couldn't even own land to build a church. And that was another difficulty because, again, as I mentioned earlier, you couldn't technically worship in a private house. That was against the law as well. So this fledgling group of Church of England parishioners of Christ Church, they ended up finally in 1689 to be able to go to a church in Boston. By the force of the royal governor, Edmund Andros, he decided that he wanted a building for the Church of England. He was meeting in the Congregational Church in Boston, which they absolutely hated. And he finally decided, well, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. And so the governor, Andros, took a portion where they are now, took a portion of a cemetery or burial ground up there, and he said, this is where I'm building a chapel for the Church of England. So it wasn't voluntary, it wasn't accepted, but it was done because he was the royal governor. And King's Chapel was squeezed into that little churchyard where it sits now. Not that building, it was a little wooden building and kind of shabby looking. It was later built from Quincy quarry, Quincy granite later on. But Governor Andros decided that not only should the English gentry of Boston have a Church of England to worship in, so shouldn't the Church of England people in Quincy. And he, in a few moments I'll get to it, he helped establish the church here. There was another thing that the neighbors of Church of England people here in Quincy faced. A majority of them were Jacobites. And I don't know if any of you remember the history of Jacobites. Jacobites were, in the history of the American Jacobites is often overlooked. but it's actually a very fascinating story as that of their British counterparts. So without going into great depth, the gentrymen in Quincy were Jacobites, almost a majority of them, and they held on to the concept of the monarch's divine right to rule, and that the kings and queens ruled by the will of God. And so when the English people forced James out off of his throne, the Jacobites supported the claims of the Stuart dynasty that, Catholic or not, the heirs of James were the rightful monarchs, and not at all were James' Protestant daughter Mary and her Protestant husband William III of Orange, who was also King James's nephew. And even though that couple ruled as a king and queen, the only one in the history of England, until Mary's death in 1694, the Jacobites never accepted their right to reign. And that is one of the reasons they say is that the church here in Quincy never received silver, communion silver, from William and Mary. William and Mary always had given the colony churches gifts of silver. King's Chapel had one, Christ Church, which is commonly called now Old North, had one, and another parish had one, as well as many parishes down south. Christ Church never got any because they were aware that the people here were Jacobites. And there was actually a small investigation into them in England by the SPCK, who were told by the king and queen, what's going on with these people that you're supporting with the minister? And they don't support my husband and I as king and queen. The other part that the churchmen, and that's the name used for people that belong to the Church of England, that subscribe to the faith of the Church of England, churchmen, even though they were women, they're called churchmen. Their Puritan neighbors automatically assumed they were loyalists or Tories. It wasn't such a big thing in 1689, but as we drew closer to the Revolution of the War of Independence, they were labeled as being opposed to the Revolution against England. And they were truly despised for that, and I'll get to that in a moment. But at the time, in 1689 until 1730, Colonel Edmund Quincy notes this account. He said, "The churchmen are now scheming to get a foot in the town. If you vote to increase the portion of the taxes paid to support the minister, we'll suppress the churchmen." What he was basically saying, if we go higher on the taxes, then we'll never have a chance. The churchmen will never have a chance to establish a church here in Quincy. But they persevered. They persevered, and finally, the governor decided that it was time to get involved. Governor Shirley, who lived here before he became the royal governor, lived in Quincy. He supported the idea of having a church here in Quincy, as did many of the very wealthy gentry of Boston. And the reason for that is because Boston at that particular time had constant breakouts of smallpox, dysentery, and it was overly crowded. And these wealthy churchmen in Boston decided, we're going to build summer houses. And so the Apthorpes and the Vassals all built summer houses here in Quincy. And naturally, when they came down here, they wanted a proper church to attend. They didn't want to meet in people's homes, and they didn't want to travel back up to Boston to worship in King's Chapel. And so they, along with the royal governor, were a force to say, hey, listen up, you Puritans in Quincy. You got to bend a little bit. You got to give a little bit. And what happened is that finally, a petition was presented to the first church here in Quincy. Again, that was the established church. It was the town meeting. Everybody belonged to it. It's where all of the votes were taking place and everything else. But finally, in 1725, they presented to the town meeting a petition. It had 3 parts to it. One was that the brothers William and Benjamin Vesey, they wanted to convey 1/4 of an acre of their land as a free gift to the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel, and in quotes, for the building of a Church of England and no other purpose. That was it. Just to build a Church of England, no other purpose. And at the same time, churchmen from Quincy and Boston pledged funds, not only to build an edifice, a church building, but also to pay the expense of sending Ebenezer Miller, a native of Milton, a graduate of Harvard. He went overseas with the intention of studying at Oxford. And then, when he got his degree at Oxford, he would apply to the Society of the Preservation of the Gospel to become a missioner to Quincy. So this was all going on at the same time. It was a multi-level petition. And finally, in 1727, the newly ordained minister of the First Church, the Reverend John Hancock Jr., and the voting males of the North Precinct consented to allow this to happen. So they agreed that this should go on. And they also, as Reverend Hancock with pride recorded, that never before any act of this nature passed in the government. So in reality, even though there were other areas of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, other Church of England that were trying to do the same thing, the church here in Quincy was the first one to establish what would be later known as religious freedom. You have to remember that the Quakers were forced out, the Baptists were forced out, and Hutchison was forced out. There was no other church in the Massachusetts Bay Colony but the Puritan Church. King's Chapel was established by the force of the royal governor. Christ Church, Quincy, was established by the will of the people to have religious freedom. And so this is marked by the Reverend Hancock, that this was an act of this nature has never been passed in government before. And that was actually the start of a very friendly relationship between the two churches of Christian faith. From that moment on, the Church of England and the Puritan Church here, they were on very, very friendly terms. And we have an account from Charles Francis Adams in his diary, his recollections. And he writes about 1727, when the Reverend Miller had been ordained in England, had come over. He discovered that an unpretentious church building had been built on that little 1/4 of an acre, and that land had been set aside for him to build a house on. He came in 1727, and Charles Francis Adams writes, Miller came home to his own people in the autumn of 1727, arriving in season to begin his pastorate on Christmas Day. And accordingly, he said, Judge Sewell, who was a Puritan judge in Boston who kept very detailed accounts of the comings and going of colonial Boston, Judge Sewell made the following entry in his journal. Monday, December 25th, 1727. Shops open, and people come to town with hoop poles, hay, wood, etc. Mr. Miller keeps the day in his new church at Braintree, and people flock thither. And the reason I bring that up is because in 1659, the Massachusetts Bay Colony enacted a law called Penalty for Keeping Christmas. They didn't want you to keep Christmas. It was pagan. It was popish. It had nothing to do. And so you weren't allowed to do anything on Christmas Day. And that was, although not completely enforced, that law was still present. And the Puritan church here in Quincy enforced it. And all the festivals were a great dishonor of God and offense to others. And yet, they allowed Dr. Miller to hold a service on Christmas Day. And that is supposedly what we've been told. That was the first recording of a Christmas Day celebration south of Boston. Some of the Church of England in Boston celebrated it, but south of Boston, this was the first one to take place in 1727. Under Dr. Miller's leadership and with the addition of the Boston-based churchmen, the parish thrived. It thrived. And those of you who go online and do searches online of Abigail Adams and John Adams' correspondence, if you just Google some of the names of the churchmen here in Quincy, you will see that they were very friendly. Abigail Adams records in her diaries and in her accounts, had tea with the Reverend Mr. Miller, or had tea with Joseph Cleverly, or had the churchmen were doing such and such. And it went on very well. They were great friends. And Reverend Miller died in 1763, and he had overseen Christ Church's parish for 36 years. And he was also very instrumental in founding new Church of England parishes to the south and west of Quincy. And he was quickly succeeded by the Reverend Edward Winslow, who was another appointed missionary of the Society of the Propagation of the Gospel. And then, things were flourishing, not only here in Quincy, but in Boston and in other parts of Massachusetts Bay Colony until the American War of Independence. The American War of Independence brought the wrath of persecution down on the Church of England in New England, and the result of that was at the end of the American War of Revolution, it left the Church of England a mere shadow of its pre-war self. And here in Quincy, the Reverend Edward Winslow faced the journey to the American War for Independence as a traitor to the country. He was connected to the established church in England. He was under the direction of the Bishop of London, and he and all clergy of the Church of England were bound by the crown by a special oath to allegiance, which required them to pray for the king and royal family. They had no choice about it whatsoever. They took an oath saying that in their prayers each Sunday they would lift up, as they do in England now, they would lift up the royal family. And for this reason, if you continue to do that, the Puritans and the Congregationalists said, forget it. We don't want you. We want nothing to do with you at all. And the state legislation, the colony of Massachusetts Bay, passed a law specifically prohibiting them from abiding by this oath of allegiance. And Abigail Adams makes a comment about that. She wrote to her husband on the 26th of September, 1776, shortly after the Declaration of Independence had been read from the pulpit of the Congregational First Church and entered into the records of the town. She wrote, "The church," meaning Christ Church, "is opened here every Sunday, and the king prayed for as usual, in open defiance of Congress." And John Adams replied, first he expressed his surprise, and then he declared that nothing of this kind was heard anywhere in this country except New York and Braintree. This practice, this treason against the state, he said, cannot be tolerated. And so they were forced to close. Abigail wrote again to John in April 1777 saying, "The church, Christ Church's doors were shut up last Sunday in consequence of a presentment. A farewell sermon was preached and much weeping and wailing, persecuted to be sure, but not for righteousness' sake." And so she made a big dig of all her friends that it wasn't for righteousness' sake that they were closed. And then finally, to follow up on that, the townmen were so furious at the Church of England. In June of 1777, the selectmen of Quincy presented the following names at a town meeting for the purpose of agreeing on a list of those people dwelling in Braintree who were esteemed inimical to the popular cause of independence. And on that list was just about every male member of Christ Church, Quincy, including the Reverend Winslow. So the town took a vote and said, absolutely, these people were inimical to the cause of independence. They need to be jailed. And it was a unanimous vote. And William Penniman was chosen to procure evidence of their disloyalty and to bring them to court. And in the meantime, they were harassed. They were harassed by the town people. And it was so bad that the Reverend Winslow hastily departed from Quincy in order to avoid being continued persecution. And even though he was under guard from the colonial soldiers in Boston, they did, which I think was amazing, they did a prisoner exchange. And so Reverend Winslow was allowed to go free in exchange for a Patriot soldier that the English had held. And so Reverend Winslow was able to get on a ship and sail down to New York, which held its neutrality in the War of Independence. It wasn't as bad as up here in New England. It held on to not a strong foothold, but the Church of England was accepted down there pretty much. And he later became a chaplain in the British Army in New York. And as it turns out, the church members of Christ Church were never prosecuted for being inimical to the cause of independence. And so the building's closed. Christ Church technically closed for Sunday worship, as did most of the churches in Boston and throughout New England. And like Christ Church, most of them were led by lay ministers. And so Joseph Cleverly was one of the lay ministers of the parish who kept the church going by reading morning prayer and excluding the prayers for the king. And that's what happened. It was pretty much shut down until 1822. It's a long time. It was after the Revolution. It was well after the rebuilding of the country after the Revolution. In 1822, the Reverend Benjamin C. Cutler came. And he turned the parish around. He turned the parish around, and he developed, actually, as I'll say in a few minutes, a very good relationship with the Adams family. Now I'm going to kind of swift my direction. First, as a parish, as a Christian faith community, this parish acknowledges that some Christians have and continue to use the words of the Bible to justify their bigotry and enslavement to human beings. It's a fact. That is a proof and fact. And if you look at the history, my own personal feelings is that sometimes you're seeing this emerging again in white Christian nationalism. So I just say that as an aside. And as a parish, we acknowledge that some of the very early colonial benefactors of Christ Church, they enslaved people, and they held indentured workers, and they financially benefited from all of those related enterprises, and as did the parish. And today, as the parish, we acknowledge and repent of those acts, and we We commit to following the imperative of Jesus to do justice. The trouble is, there is very, very little historical data and facts within our parish and within the community of Quincy to make an understanding of how enslaved people were treated. We know that from the history of the Mass Bay Colony, we know that indentured servants were common. They were very common during the colonial era, and they were used for forced cheap labor. But an indentured servant had the opportunity to buy their freedom. So after about 5 or 7 years, they had worked off their debt, and they were allowed to go free. And that was kind of expensive for those that took advantage of indentured servants. And so many landowners began to feel threatened. They said, well, all these indentured servants, well, they're now free people, and look at, they're coming into our communities, they're doing this, and who's helping us? Who's doing our work? And so the colonial elite realized that the problems of indentured servitude were many, and that it was more profitable for them to look toward chattel slavery. Chattel slavery was more profitable, and sadly, it was an ever-renewable source of labor. And then there was a big shift from indentured servants to racial slavery beginning. And slaveholders here in Quincy and in Boston, they were tanners, judges, innkeepers, merchants, farmers. And there were also very wealthy who owned plantations and rum-producing plantations in the West Indies. And that was an accepted thing. Neither the Church of England nor the Puritan Congregational Church produced any moral or theological objections to enslavement. There were people that said it shouldn't be done, but there was no official act, at least in the colonies, to end it. And the dogma of the church and the predominant teaching of the church was that keeping slaves was biblically justified. It was justified by how they read the Bible, and it was also indenturing your fellow free citizens was justified as well. And so if we look at the history of Quincy, we know that both the First Church and Christ Church had parishioners who were enslavers. And the common practice, at least in Quincy, seemed to be avoid using the word slave when they talked about them. They opted instead to use the wording, which is perhaps a hangover from indentured workers. They always use the wording servant of or belonging to. And according to a report by Hobart Hawley, who's a parishioner of this parish and a fellow with the Quincy Historical Society, as well as other historical societies, Mr. Hawley noted that at least in Quincy, those who were enslaved worked in families of the wealthy more as staff. So they worked as cooks, they worked as houseboys, house girls, drivers, that type of thing. It's not common to find them working as we hear later on when slavery was at its peak down south as picking cotton and things like that. It didn't seem to happen up here according to the research that Hobart Hawley found. But again, we can't guarantee that because we just don't have any historical information. It's all verbal information. So the 1754 census of Old Braintree, Quincy, it listed 36 Negro slaves, 16 years of age or older. And in 1765, the census listed a total of 66 Negroes, including children. And this parish knows that we have parishioners who own slaves, enslaved people. And in our case, this included people beginning with the clergymen, our first American-born clergymen, the Reverend Miller and the Reverend Winslow. We know that the Vesey family, who conveyed the property to Christ Church, owned slaves. We know that the descendants of Charles Apthorpe, who gave the current plot that we now sit on, not the entire churchyard, but just the current area of the church. Charles Apthorpe was an English-born merchant and slave trader in Boston, and he managed his import business from Merchants Row, that section behind Faneuil Hall. Faneuil was another slave trader, and in his day, he was called the richest man in Boston. And we also know that the Alleyne family, who first lived on Milton Hill and later bought what is now called the Dorothy Quincy House, and lived in the Dorothy Quincy House for 3 generations, despite the efforts of Abigail Adams to buy it back. Not only did they own slaves here in Quincy, but the Alleyne family owned and still have a share in a very large plantation in Barbados. And that plantation is known for its Mount Gay rum. And at least for the Alleyne family, they have acknowledged their acts of enslavement, and they have made attempts at restitution in many forms have taken place by the Alleyne family. Then we had another parishioner, Leonard Vassall. And many of you may know that the Vassall family was large, and they intermarried with the royal family, and they intermarried with other families. And they were one of the biggest enslavers in the colonies of Massachusetts. Leonard Vassall moved here. He built Peace House, the old Peace House, which eventually Abigail and John bought from his estate. But he also owned a huge plantation in the West Indies, in Jamaica. And when he died in 1737, you can go online and get an evaluation of his estate from the British, I can't remember the name of it, but the British force that went into the history of enslavement of people. And his will was probated, his estate was probated in Jamaica in 1738. And according to the probate, slave ownership at probate was 131 slaves, of whom 119 were listed as male and 101 as female. 51 were listed as boys, girls, or children. So this was a man well loved in the city of the town of Quincy, well loved in the colony of Quincy, that got all of his wealth from a plantation in Jamaica. And so that's a little bit of what we face as a parish, as does First Church. We don't have a lot of facts, we don't have a lot of written information, it was all verbal information, but we know that in some way that we have benefited. We benefited because we own a property down there on School Street, we own this little section of where our building is, thanks in part to the generosity of slaveholders. And then we have a slave of the Reverend Ebenezer Miller, the first American-born minister. And that is of Caesar. Caesar was a slave. He was baptized in the church on the 31st of January, 1731, age unknown. He was married in the church to a woman named Mattie, a servant owned by Phoebe Vassall. And they were married on the 28th of November, 1738. The couple's children were all baptized at Christ Church. And then upon the death of the Reverend Miller in 1763, all of Reverend Miller's property, including Caesar, transferred to his son, Colonel Ebenezer Miller, Esquire. And it's sad, in a way, because Caesar was very generous. He was accepted here. He was considered a member of the parish. He would sign the parish register. He didn't have to sit in an area designated for slaves. He sat on his own. Even though his wife didn't belong to Reverend Miller. She belonged to someone else, to Phoebe Vassal, and when Phoebe Vassal died, she was transferred over to or bought by another person. It's very sad that in many ways that what he decided to do, and we don't have all of the facts on this, Caesar in 1770 gave the parish what is probably one of our most poignant gifts, a silver chalice. And a copy of it's there on your handout. And the records indicate that Caesar gave the cup to the parish out of devotion to the church at a time when most churches would not accept him. And the chalice was made by a very well-to-do Boston silversmith, Samuel Minot, and it's inscribed, "Given for the service of the Holy Communion to the Christ Church in Braintree by Caesar, servant to E. Miller, Esquire, 1770. And that's the son. That's not Reverend Miller, that's the son who inherited Caesar. So this chalice, according to tradition, again, we don't have anything written down, it was most likely his only material possession of intrinsic value. And the parish was very appreciative of this gift. And they passed a formal vote on Easter Monday, 1770, of thanking Caesar for the gift, and it was valued at being set at 20 English pounds in 1770. Caesar died on October 2nd, 1771, about 65 years of age, and he's recorded that he was buried in the Miller family tomb. And so he's down in the Old Churchyard, and he's buried there along with, that we know of, at least 3 to 4 other slaves, an American Indian, and an unknown British soldier who washed up on the shores of the beach in Quincy. And they didn't know what to do with him, so they figured he was Church of England, and they buried him there. And so it's an amazing history that we have. And the other part that we know of is that, at least according to records, by the early 1780s, Massachusetts had voted out and stopped the legal practice of chattel slavery. But it still continued in very quiet ways. And as we all know, Rhode Island became the hotbed of slave trade after Massachusetts ended. Switching gears, there's also a very strong connection between Christ Church and the German indentured workers. They're called migrants in history nowadays, but they weren't really migrants. Technically, I guess you could call them, but they were indentured workers who arrived here around 1750 to work on the land that was leased from Colonel John Quincy to a company consisting of John Franklin, who was the brother of Benjamin, Norton Quincy, and Peter Eder, who was a parishioner here of Christ Church. And it was headed by a German immigrant, Joseph Ceruleus. And together they decided that they were going to build the first community of industrial development in this country. And so when they took that land, they divided it into streets and squares with names like Bern and Hanover and Hague and Zurich. And they decided that this was going to be the first industrial development in the country, and they were going to make wonderful glass. And Peter Eder, he was born in Switzerland. He and his first wife were very active in the community of Quincy. Eder was very active in local politics. He was very friendly with John Adams, but he was also a Tory. And when the Revolution came, he left Boston for Halifax with the British troops in 1776. And just before that, the three of them were smart enough to get out of the glassworks in Germantown because it wasn't a successful venture for them. And it was taken over by some other people. And I know that Melissa McGrew is doing a whole big piece on Germantown, so I hope that that will come out soon to give you more information. But I want to just offer up one connection that I think is very interesting. The German indentured workers came over here. They had to be Protestant. They didn't want any of the Roman Catholic Germans coming over. They had to be Protestant, which meant they were probably mostly Lutheran. They came over. They found no church to their liking. There was the Puritan Church and there was the Church of England. That was it. And so they decided to affiliate with Christ Church. And they were baptized, married, and everything else within Christ Church. Hobart Holly did a huge, extensive genealogical listing of the people that came over. It's wonderful, but I just want to highlight one person, a young boy named Christopher Cider. Christopher Cider, if some of you know your history, he became a revolutionary martyr. He was born to a German couple who were working in the glassworks. He was baptized at Christ Church, as was his sister. And then after the Cider's servitude was finished, they moved the family to Boston to find employment. Now, they weren't taught, the kids weren't taught anything. They didn't have schools or anything. They weren't allowed to go to the school here in Quincy, the public school here in Quincy. So they didn't have many skills. And so Christopher was employed by the Apthorpe family as a houseboy at their mansion in Boston. On 22nd February 1770, there was turbulence in the north end of Boston. And some of you may remember the story. Ebenezer Richardson, a customs officer in the employ of the king, had fired his gun out his front window into an angry crowd who were harassing him. And the result of that is that 2 boys were wounded. And one of them, Christopher, 12 years old, didn't make it through the night. He died. And the town's political organizers decided that he was a martyr for freedom, for revolutionary cause. The problem is, in hindsight, he probably wasn't part of that group of boys who were taunting Ebenezer Richardson, because he knew he worked for the Apthorpes, and he knew that people would recognize him as working for the Apthorpes, and that his job would be in jeopardy. And so many people think that he was an innocent bystander. He wasn't part of the people harassing Ebenezer Richardson. But at that particular time, the political organizers, the people that wanted freedom from England, they organized a huge funeral from King's Chapel, which was technically the boy's parish because he was Church of England, and the Apthorpe family was Church of England, and that was their parish. And they organized a huge public funeral. And a procession went from the Church of England to where he's buried in the old burial ground on Boston Common. And it was also, they claim, that the passions that were ignited on that particular occasion of his funeral eventually led to the Boston Massacre 1 week later. Who knows? Who knows? But again, most of our history comes from verbal accounts, nothing truly written down. And then I'm going to end with the connection with Christ Church and the Adams family. We live in Quincy, we always have some connection to the Adams family. There's just no way of getting around it. And it's a connection that varied over time and conditions. One of our parishioners, Joseph Cleverly, taught and prepared boys for Harvard at the Latin School here in Quincy. And President John Adams was one of his students, former students. And years later, President Adams recalled his former teacher by saying, "Cleverly was the most indolent man I ever knew, a bigoted Episcopalian of the school of Dr. Saunders and Dr. Hicks, a downright conscientious, passive obedience man in church and state." He had no desire, no like for Joseph Cleverly as a teacher. In fact, he got his father to have him removed from being taught by Joseph Cleverly, and he ended up being taught privately by Joseph Marsh before becoming a student at Harvard in 1751 at the age of 15. But as a companion, he and his wife had tea with Joseph Cleverly. They socialized together, but they held vastly different political views. And again, if you go through the papers of President John Adams, First Lady Abigail Adams, President John Quincy Adams, and First Lady Louise Catherine Adams, you will find the parishioners of Christ Church in pre-colonial times constantly mentioned. So the war came, Christ Church was shut down, and then, as I said, the Reverend Cutler came to Quincy. And the Reverend Cutler was a very charismatic man. He attracted people regardless of their faith tradition, and he also attracted John, Abigail, John Quincy, and Louisa. Louisa was a parishioner anyway of the church, but both John, Abigail, and John Quincy truly admired Cutler as a pastor and as a preacher. And they attended services, not often, but they did attend services down at the original building on School Street. And then as the time grew, that the church was growing beyond the space of the church down on School Street, they decided to move to our present site in 1832. And they were still fairly wealthy at that time, and they built a very large wooden Gothic-style church that was designed by Solomon Willard of Quincy granite fame. And the design of that church, built in 1832, was very similar to the church that was built, the first Trinity Church in Boston. Not the one in Copley Square, but when it was built down on Sumner Street in Boston. Looked almost the exact same look. It was a Gothic style, beautiful, and it had a bell. And that was important because one of the things that they never allowed the first church down on School Street to have was a bell, because they truly didn't want the townspeople to hear the Church of England people calling them to worship. So they were never allowed to have a bell down on School Street. Now they could. And that, as we just heard sung, that's when parishioner Louise Catherine, who was a musician and poet in her own right, wrote that very original and lengthy hymn for the consecration of the newly built church. And then finally, the Adams deed of 25 June 1822 notes that provided that if the Episcopal Church of Quincy should at any time hereafter build a church for the worship of God, that it shall have the liberty of taking from these pasture lands as much stone as they need to use in erecting such church. And again, nothing is written down because they just didn't do those types of things back then. But the verbal history says that when the third building was built here, the one that Catherine wrote the hymn for and the one that she worshiped in along with the other Adams family burnt, when they built the third building, which was of stone, it came from the quarry rubble of the Adams family. When that one, the predecessor of this one, had an interior fire, this one was built upon its foundations. And so this area here is on the exact same layout of the third building, the first stone one, with the addition of the chancel and the apse. The third building didn't have that. So this area is new. This area is on the foundations of the third building. And then the other connection, one more connection, when the first Sunday School of Christ Church was gathered in 1820, it was formed in part by Susanna Boylston Adams Clark Treadway. She was the granddaughter of John Adams. And she lived with John Adams, her grandfather, at the old house to care for him later in life. Abigail had died. And according to the verbal history of the parish, it was said that a wagon from the old house would go through the streets of Quincy, stopping on certain corners to pick up the church school students and then bring them back to the old house for their lessons. And so I can just imagine that some of these children not only had the honor of being in the old house, but I'm sure at some point they must have met President John Adams as well. And then after their classes were over, they would bring them back to the corners where they were picked out. So this is just a little bit, just a snapshot of the very rich and varied history of this parish. And now, over 300 years later, we can say that just as those first Church of England parishioners in 1689 faced challenges and opportunities, so doesn't the parish today. We face similar challenges and opportunities, and we face ways that we need to learn how to adapt and renew what we claim as a Christian congregation. We have to renew the transformational practices of God, and as we see God through Christ. So we're always in the process of reimagining practices, and we're always offering up to people, just as those in 1689 did, something new, something beautiful. We simply invite those with eyes and ears and heart and soul to experience it, to get a little taste of God in Christ. And I think that's a very important thing for churches in particular to understand, is that we're always needing to reimagine what the voice of God as present in a church setting is like in a particular time, in a particular place, and most importantly, in a particular neighborhood. So many of you might know that we're very much involved in our neighborhood. Our building is open 7 days a week for community groups, for a yoga group, for people in AA, for people that are going through grief therapy. We're part of the neighborhood. Our former rectory beside us, down on the end of our churchyard, is a 9-room, single-room occupancy home for men who would probably be homeless. It's managed for us by Neighborhood Housing Services. It's been used for alternative housing for about 30 years. One of our rectors got here and said, there's no way with kids I'm going to live in a 14-room house on the middle of Elm Street and High School Avenue with no yard or anything else for my kids to play in. And he decided to move out of it, and the church began to look at adaptive ways to use that building, and it's continued ever since. And I think that's so important to remember, is that not only churches, but synagogues, mosques, temples, anything that promotes faith needs to be able to be relevant and vital in a neighborhood where they live. And that, I think, is what we offer to the Quincy community now. Our building is about to be repointed. Our entire building is about to be repointed by a very generous gift from the Community Preservation Fund. It's going to be a 3-year repointing, and it's a testimony, as the group said, to the witness of Christ Church, not only in Quincy and in this neighborhood, but to the greater community as well. As a parish, we don't pull just from our neighborhood. As a parish, we pull from the greater communities around us. So we have people from Weymouth and Braintree and Hingham and Milton and all around, as many churches do today as well. And so I thank you. I thank you for your attention. I hope it was interesting. I hope it brought some things to light. 2 things. I don't know what the weather's like now. You are welcome to go into the Great Hall of the Parish House, where our historian, Diane Grondin, and her crew have put on a display of some of the historic silver, including the Caesar chalice out in the other room. You're also welcome to walk down to the Old Churchyard, which is beside St. John's. Because of the rain, I will not be opening the crypt. The crypt was built underneath the church when the church was there. It was never meant to be exposed to the elements. So we have to be very careful that we don't let water into the crypt. It's dirt. And originally it didn't have dirt over it. It was just a brick covering. And you can kind of see that through the dirt that's on it now. But if water gets in there, there's a potential that the walls could obviously come down. And as we still use that for interring the cremains of parishioners, I don't think those whose cremains are in there would like that to happen, nor would I like to be in there when I do that and having it fall on me as well. I will be available tomorrow, Sunday, at 2 o'clock down there, if you would like to come back and look at the crypt. You won't see much, I will be honest with you. When the church building was taken down, again, anything that you see that is a mound was underneath the church building, so you never saw them. Any of you who might have gone to Christ Church in Cambridge and taken a tour of the Vassal tomb in Cambridge, that's what they look like. It was just a brick mound underneath the church building. There were steps going down into the vault, and bodies would be placed on the side. We have family tombs, the Aline family, the Vassal family, the Apthorpe family, and then we had a common tomb which was known as the parish tomb, and that was slightly longer, and so you would go down the stairs, there was an anteroom, and you would go down just a very short pathway, and off to the side would be levels where they would place the bodies. And at that time, many of them were not put into caskets. They were just buried in shrouds. And as their bodies went back to nature, decomposed, the remains were just kind of pushed further down until another body took its place. But you have to remember, not a lot of people wanted to be buried underneath the church. And when Mount Wollaston opened, some of the families actually decided that they wanted to exhume their relatives who were in vaults, and they moved them down to Mount Wollaston, which, believe it or not, was a very common practice. I never realized how many bodies have been exhumed and moved around in the 1840s, I believe. So anyway, that's that. I don't know what time it is. It's 11:15. We're a little bit over the time that I said. If there are any particular questions that you would like, pressing questions that you would like me to try to answer, I'd be happy to. Otherwise, you're welcome to walk down. Steve, raise your hand. Steve Golden will be leading the group down, and Jennifer Golden will be leading the group down the street and opening up the gate. Rita Cavonius, who is a caretaker of the gardens there. She does a wonderful job. She may or may not be walking down. I don't know. It depends on the weather. Again, or you can go and look at the silver in the Great Hall, or I would be happy to try to answer a few questions.
Can we just say, like, the people who are going down to the churchyard, they probably want to see the silver.
Whatever you would like. Whatever you would like.
Can they just wait a little bit before they take them? Can they wait a little bit before they
so,
take them down? So
you just know where it's right beside St. John the Evangelist Roman Catholic Church. Can't miss it.
I said this was
blocks down School Street,
yeah.
And they'll be down there with the gate open, so that way you can be able to see it.
Yeah. So I said there's a secret treasure or something in that room, and that's the silver of Caesar. So I think everyone should go in there and look, and then, if you want to go down. How many people are going to want to come back at 2 o'clock tomorrow? Is there anybody who would come at 2 o'clock tomorrow or not?
Okay, good.
Okay, so yeah, it'll be open then.
So you can park here and walk down, or St. John's is very gracious, and you can park at St. John's parking lot in there. But I'll be there at 2 o'clock, unless it's raining again. Hopefully it won't be, but if it's raining again, same thing. I can't open the crypt if it's raining.
So thank you so much, Cliff. It was wonderful.
winter solstice that I went on in Germantown froze my toes off. But she does a wonderful job, and it seems every time that they have them going out to like Pine Island and the other ones, I just can't make it. A wonderful